I'm going to call your attention to a book that I've not yet read, but is very good. There are a few modern economists that make the current economic situation understandable. Mike Hudson is one of them, and Steve Keen is one of the other ones. And I'm going to be talking about the Fed and economics next week, and I just wanted you to be aware of it because I have found it necessary to download 10 interviews or documentaries with Mike Hudson to know what he thinks and how he sees the situation. I've only had to download 2 or 3 of Steve Keen, and I can't tell you where the difference is, but he makes sense more faster to me than Mike Hudson does. And I'm excited about today's presentation, somewhat discouraged, and I'm going to be asking for your participation in several parts of it. So that might be off-putting for one or another of you, but I hope not. Before I address this is really a lesson in how to learn. You'll recall a long time ago, we talked about the trivium and the quadrivium, the way of learning how to learn that the Greeks learned. They first learned grammar, public speaking, and logic. Those tools of language by which you can use language in order to say something of substance. Not how you feel, but something about the outside world. So you need logic so that you don't say black is white. You need grammar in order to put a subject, verb, and predicate, or subject, verb, and the correct pronouns, adverbs, and adjectives together. And you need public speaking or public writing, or both, in order to present that language in a fashion that is understandable to other people. That's the trivium. The quadrivium is underneath it, and the trivium is related to understanding the logic, the rules of logic as it applies to language. The quadrivium concerns how those rules of logic apply not just to the language, but to the real world. It cannot be one at the same time that the earth revolves around the sun and the sun revolves around the earth, because they're logically incompatible. And this statement is really another way of saying how language relates to learning and how learning relates to understanding the rest of the world. Unfortunately, our educational system is geared toward kids learning a lot of facts, but it is not geared toward teaching them how to understand the relationship of fact A to B to fact C and fact D. This is related to the world of politics. Real intelligence in politics is the ability to see connections that are not necessarily obvious, but sometimes they are, such as the ability to see the interconnectedness of all life, of all peoples, and of all wars. One of the obvious examples is there's a direct connection between World War I and World War II. There is a direct connection between, unfortunately, our educational system is geared toward kids learning a lot of facts, but it is not geared toward teaching them how to understand the relationship of fact A to B to fact C and fact D. This is related to the world of politics. Real intelligence in politics is the ability to see connections that are not necessarily obvious, but sometimes they are, such as the ability to see the interconnectedness of all life, of all peoples, and of all wars. One of the obvious examples is there's a direct connection between World War I and World War II. There is a direct connection between, we're talking about mass hysteria, the rules of procedure, and what has, so creatively, in terms of language usage, has so creatively been invented to talk about torture as if it is enhanced interrogation. Now, this is a thesis that also came up in the most recent talk that Richard Wolff gave on the current economy. Chief among the common misconceptions about the way official propaganda works. By official propaganda, we're talking about the written matrix, not the matrix of, not so much the matrix of the talking heads on television or the written dogma on your newspapers, but the misconceptions about the way official propaganda works. The idea is not to deceive, not so much to deceive the public into believing things that aren't true. That's a fortuitous development if it happens. But official propaganda, they are pleased if somebody does happen to believe it. If you happen to believe that 9/11 was caused by 19 terrorists, 19 Arab terrorists, great, but you don't have to. What you have to do is this. It's to generate an official narrative. Its factualness is not the point. And I suspect everyone in this room has discovered it. The factualness is not the point. The official story is intended to generate two categories of people, two categories of citizens. Citizens who agree with the official narrative and citizens who are on the outside. It's an ideological boundary. The ruling classes want the people to be on the inside to affirm the official story, and anyone on the outside, they are contradicting the narrative. Inside is normal society. You've all seen this. This is not particularly new to you. Normal society, gainful employment, career advancement, all the other considerable benefits of cooperating with the ruling classes. My younger son teaches at a relatively conservative university. I am certain that to the extent that he agrees with me, he does not discuss politics with his colleagues. To the extent that he doesn't agree with me, he probably does discuss politics. The point is, he's in an institution where it's quite important to be socially acceptable. In fact, I found it amusing. I was socially acceptable when I was doing and teaching anesthesia at the University of Iowa, except and until I broached certain questions, and there were a very few number of brave professors who were willing to ask me questions and willing to be educated and share information with me. Sometimes contradicted me. I have no problem with that. I'm interested in their facts. But just engaging a person like you or me in conversation on these subjects is socially dangerous to people who are on the inside. Because, let's face it, we're viewed as weird. Outside, inside is the benefits of cooperating with the ruling classes. Outside, poverty, anxiety, social and professional stigmatization, and various other forms of suffering. Which side of the wall do you want to be on? In countless ways, we are asked and have to answer this question. Conform, and there's a place for you inside. Refuse, well, good luck out there. Long before people questioned 9/11, and somewhat before questioning the murder of John F. Kennedy, the first taboo of World War II was presented to the American public. That's the line that we're going to cross today. Why the title Mass Hysteria? In sociology and psychology, mass hysteria, it's also known as collective hysteria and group hysteria. It's a phenomenon that transmits collective illusions of threats from one person to another, from one subculture to another. Collective illusions of threats, real or imaginary, to a population in a society as a whole. And that result, this collective illusion is the result of rumors and fear. And it's facilitated if you or I have a memory of a similar event in the past. It's much easier for me to believe in a disaster in the future if I've already experienced a disaster in the past. I'm going to stop at this point and ask you two questions. I'm going to ask for your involvement in it. Let's suppose that you are back in the 17th century and you are one of 7 girls who are participating. The guys can put themselves through this too. There are probably some male attendants with this group of girls. And 6 of the other girls swore that they saw Madam Old Hag, cavorting with Satan on the top of a hill. And they were all terrified, but they were curious too, so they had to get closer. Now, you are one of those 7 girls. The inquisitor in this New England town, who is totally intent on punishing the witch, and if the witch has any accomplices among these 7 girls, he is intent on punishing that person as well. And these 7 girls have all said they were watching, but they didn't cooperate, they didn't participate. Now, you have the hope of saving your skin and not being accused of being Madam Witch's accomplice. What are you going to tell the inquisitor? Serious question. Any quick ideas, Dennis?
No.
Are you going to say the 6 girls are lying and they didn't see Madam cavorting with the Satan?
No, I don't think so.
You think you're going to confirm that you saw her cavorting with Satan too, but you didn't want to cooperate?
Something like that.
Any other ideas?
Well, one would hope that one would say, no, this didn't happen.
I know, but I'm talking about the real world.
To do that is up for grabs.
Yeah.
I would say, before I had children, I mean, I wanted to go to Cuba, there are a lot of things where, if it was just my life, I would take a moral stance and do it. Say, like, you know, I'm gonna go fight for this or whatever, if I die, I die. But as soon as I had children, that did change. So then I did make compromises, and I probably wouldn't do it because they're dependent on me and I have to go along with the group.
And remember, the inquisitor already believes in witchcraft, already believes that Madam Witch is a witch. His primary goal now is to see whether that witch has recruited any of these 7 girls. I would submit that your first task is not to refute the idea that witchcraft is real. Your first idea is not to refute the idea that Madam Witch is a witch. Your first idea is to save your skin. Am I fairly correct there?
Yeah.
Now, let me give you a second example that involves 3 details. You have to describe something in exquisite detail. You've already been convicted in the minds of the prosecutor. The prosecutor already knows you're guilty, but wants you to expand on the evil deed that you just did. And you know you're going to be convicted. No question whatsoever. That's a foregone conclusion. Regardless of the facts, you're going to be convicted. But you have a child who may, in 20 years, have a child. You would like to send in your testimony, you would like to send a message to your grandchild, potential grandchild, that this is a farce trial, that this is a kangaroo court, you're going to have to invent something, okay? Or someone has already presented you with the outline of a story, and they want you to fill in the details of the story. Is the situation fairly clear in your minds? Now, how would you create and or modify your story to send your grandchild the message that you were roped into this and that the whole affair is bullshit?
You could exaggerate it so that it sounded completely.
Excellent. I didn't expect such a good answer right off the bat. Any addendum to that?
Well, if they're symbols that a group knows, that means this is a lie, as I think some people say there are in the military. So when these guys are testifying, they do whatever the hand signal is. I don't know what it is, which has the message being, I'm being forced to say this, but I'm being forced.
Another form of nonverbal communication. In the case that Joan is mentioning, she's using words in order to create an absurd situation. In the example you're giving, you're using nonverbal language. You're using a different language in order to communicate a different meaning. Oddly enough, the Germans who were accused of participating in the Holocaust very frequently did this, and we'll be getting to that, but I want to give you a couple, no, just one example. In the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, he says that a little hut that's 200 miles from the nearest sea, a little hut that they were going to be using for carbon monoxide poisoning of victims. They needed a source, an engine to create the carbon monoxide. So they used a leftover, or what's it when something is destroyed but something's left over? A salvage. A salvaged diesel engine from a submarine that the Germans had caught from the Soviets. They brought that in to supply carbon monoxide for this villager's hut that they were going to fill with the exhaust of diesel fumes so that the people inside the hut would be asphyxiated. Now, the Germans never caught a Soviet submarine. A submarine engine is a huge, monstrous thing. Bringing it 200 miles is absurd. The exhaust from a diesel engine is totally useless for asphyxiating someone, unlike an internal combustion engine that is run by a spark plug. A diesel engine creates almost zero carbon monoxide. I would submit, before we even get to some of the other points, that Adolf Eichmann was sending his grandchildren, or his great-grandchildren, or the German people, a message. That's only one of a number of examples. Before considering World War II per se, let's consider a few other events in history. In the book of Esther, you have the Jewish people being put in danger by that nasty Persian sublord, Haman. And coming to the rescue is Mordecai and Queen Esther. And Haman is identified as the bad guy. Esther saves the day, and the Jews acquire a number of proselytes in Persia. Now, I'm describing it as if it's history, but there's no evidence of Haman. There's no evidence of the king that was involved. It's delightful fiction. Go to the book of Daniel, written sometime about 200 to 300 years before Christ. You have a wicked Gentile ruler, persecuting Jewish people, and courageous Jewish stalwart, faithful people standing up to the mean Gentile ruler and vindicating both their God and their faith and their people. You get a similar story. Now, both of those are fiction. First and second Maccabees are much closer to authentic history and much closer to a complex, real description of what happened in the Maccabean revolt. Step forward about 1,500 years, I always have trouble with his name, the Helminsky massacres that took place in the Kingdom of Poland about 1640, I believe. I might be wrong on those dates. But they were massacres that took place when the Turkish people revolted against the Polish lords and revolted against the landlords who were working for the Polish lords. You had the peasants who paid taxes, you had the landlords who collected those taxes, and you had the Polish lords who retrieved the taxes from the tax collectors. And when the Turkish people revolted and led a number of massacres against the Polish lords, guess who the Turkish, I want to call them Tartars. I'll call them Tartars because that's the land. They were both Turkish and they were Muslim, and they were caught in a situation where the peasants of Ukraine and Poland were Orthodox Christians and the Polish lords were Catholic Christians. And sandwiched in between those two layers of civilization were the Jewish landlords. In fact, 95% of the time when you find Jewish people persecuted is because they are functioning as money collectors for someone above them. But the Helminsky massacres, the estimates vary between 50,000 and 250,000 Jews massacred during the Helminsky massacres. A joke that is told among Jewish people, and I'm privy to because of certain kinds of literature I've had at my disposal, is that the number of people massacred in the Helminsky massacres doubles with about each generation. So I have no idea if the lower number of 50,000 is vastly exaggerated or fairly close to the truth. I know the 250,000 number is absurd. The point, however, is that there is a tradition of Gentiles persecuting Jews to the best of their knowledge for no good reason whatsoever. The Tsarist pogroms are also, and in fact before World War II, Tsarist Russia was the country and the political leadership that the Jews loved to hate. You know, in America, Americans love to hate Richard Nixon, and now they'll probably love to hate Donald Trump. The Jewish people, especially the Jewish people of Eastern Europe, love to hate the Tsar. You will recall that until Lloyd George made a deal with the Zionists to give Jews Palestine, before that, the American newspapers, managed primarily by American Jews, were in favor of Germany. Once Lloyd George agreed to give them Palestine, they switched and decided that they hated Germany more than they hated Tsarist Russia. But up until that point, they wanted the Allies to lose because the Tsarist Russia was allied with England and France. by the way, in terms of exaggeration of hazard, the most reliable guess that I'll call it a guess, but the most reliable guess of the number of Jews who died in the Tsarist pogroms, at least the pogrom of 1840 to 43, the largest number or not the largest, the most reliable number I found was 42. Now, historical events tend to acquire not only a life of their own, but a stature of their own. How many people died in the so-called Boston Massacre? 100?
Boston Marathon?
Pardon me?
The Boston Marathon.
No, not the Boston Marathon, the Boston Massacre.
Oh,
The
that was
Boston
just
Massacre
about
that preceded, I apologize for the
7 or
confusion.
8, it was not very many.
Boston.
The Boston
Boston
Massacre that
Massacre.
preceded the American Revolution.
Yeah.
There was 7 or 8 people, I think, and they got off with the slap on the wrist.
5.
5. I was
And not only
2 or
that,
3 off.
the peaceful, loving people of Boston were shouting at the British militia to shoot, damn you, shoot!
Well, and again, the perpetrators got off with the slap on the wrist because the people who were killed were described as Negroes, Irish, and low people.
And not only did they get off with a slap of the wrist, if you look at the data, not the legend that we have been given as Americans, but if you look at the data, the worst that any of them should have been charged with was manslaughter. But you have to look at, there's a crucial difference between the legend and the data. And frankly, as I got into researching the so-called Holocaust and the Nuremberg tribunals, any of you see Jurassic Park? You remember that scene where the female biologist is pawing through the dinosaur's excrement, looking for the source of the dinosaur's disease? Well, going through the data, especially the data on the Holocaust, is like going through the dinosaur's excrement. It's a dirty, filthy job, but it's the only way to get at the information. Now, all of these preceding events lead Gilad Atzmon to hypothesize that the Jewish tribe is the victim of pre-traumatic stress disorder. We're all familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, but Gilad says because of the way they have relayed their history from word of mouth to word of mouth over generations, they anticipate disaster before it happens. And if disaster A happens, then in the next generation, 10 times as many A's were damaged than actually what happened. And 2 generations, it's 100 times. In other words, pre-traumatic stress disorder, like mass hysteria, takes a kernel of information and blossoms it into a major event. Now, I wanted to share, up until last week, I had done a lot of preparation on this chat, and I had come to the conclusion that the Holocaust was largely the result of mass hysteria. That is, American Jews were so worried about Nazi treatment of Jews that they ballooned a political oppression into extermination. Because there's no doubt that Jews in Germany, the Jewish communists, were in prison, along with non-Jewish communists, along with non-Jewish socialists, even Nazi propaganda films, or films that admire Adolf Hitler as a leader. They admit that it was a police state. But as long as you went along with the attitudes and approaches of the police state, you were fine. Not unlike the police state in which we are currently almost living. As long as we don't tell the government what it should be doing and get in its way of doing it, none of us here are being persecuted. Stand in the way of the equipment that's going to be building a pipeline, or worse still, stand in the way of a roadway to a military installation, and you'll find out what a police state is really like. But the point is that the people of Germany that went along with the police state policies, they had a growing economy, they had food on the table, they had the restoration of a national self-respect that had been deprived of them in the Treaty of Versailles. Now, I mentioned Douglas Reed and Harold Wilton because in the process of working on this subject matter for the last week, I discovered something. Harold Wilton was a very reputable journalist writing from Russia in the second decade of the 20th century. That is between 1910 and 1920. So invariably, he wrote about the political turmoil of 1915. He wrote about the first revolution of February of 1917. And then he wrote about the second revolution of October of 1917. The first one was a revolt against the Tsar. The second one was the revolt against the democratic state that was forming in Russia, and the assumption of leadership, the assumption of the government by the Bolsheviks. And there was considerable civil war for the subsequent 2 or 3 years. In the process of writing about all of those events, he discovered something. His veracity and his reliability was fine from 1910, 1915, 1917, and February. When he started writing about the Jewish involvement, and the phenomenal Jewish involvement, in the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917, his editors said, you know, people are starting to wonder, and especially, I don't want the kind of reports you are sending in, because he was sending in accurate reports. I don't want the kind of reports you're sending in getting in the hands of the Zionists, or even worse still, the State Department. He found his editor voluntarily editing and editing out the involvement of Jewish revolutionaries in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And that debate has been going back and forth for the last 100 years. Most scholars now agree that there was a remarkable involvement of Jewish Russians, or Russian Jews, in the Bolshevik Revolution, and that this strongly influenced the nature of that revolution. It may even have influenced how people were thought of. For example, well, I won't give any examples because this is not yet well demonstrated, but the involvement of Russian Jews in the Bolshevik Revolution, in the leadership, they easily exceeded more than 50% of the leadership of the Bolshevik Revolution. They constituted easily less than 5%, I think less than 2%, but I'm not sure on that.
So are you saying that in World War II, the German government was selective about the Jewish people that they persecuted?
Absolutely.
And that there were Jewish people who lived in Germany at the time who followed the government program and were not subject to fear or persecution?
No Jew, as a Jew, was subject to persecution until after Kristallnacht of 1938. Any Jew that was persecuted up to that time was persecuted not as a Jew, but as a communist, or by some other social unacceptable person.
And after 1938, then what?
They were rounded up the way we rounded up Japanese.
Regardless of their political view, they were rounded up because they were Jewish.
Because they were seen as politically a potential fifth column. Exactly the way the Americans rounded up Japanese. Okay. What I observed with Harold Wilton was observed by Douglas Reed. He wrote what was taking place in Nazi Germany between 1930 and he quit in disgust in 1938. Because his accounts, when the secret police were rounding up people, they were rounding up political enemies. Most of them were not Jewish, some of them were. Some of them were communists. The secret police were rounding up people who were considered dangerous to the state. And Doug Reed, in his reporting, said there's no discrimination between Jew and Gentile. They're rounding up these insurrectionists. They're rounding up people who are politically dangerous. His editors said, when they changed his reports, first they changed it to they were rounding up political insurrectionists and Jews. A few reports later, they were rounding up Jews and political insurrectionists. A couple of reports later, they were rounding up Jews. There was an intention on the part of Douglas Reed's editors to maximize the nature of the offense against Jews and to be silent on the nature of the political offense against Germany. They were turning what was political persecution into racial persecution. In fact, Doug Reed was so disgusted with what his editors were doing that he quit in 1938 and started trying to publish books. Now, some of his early books were published. As soon as he started writing on anti-Zionism, he found himself persona non grata. But I found it very interesting that Harold Wilton and Doug Reed discovered the same attempt to twist history in a particular direction. And in this case, the direction is to cast the oppression of Jews into a racial formula rather than a political formula. Now remember, the Jews that were considered a fifth column in Germany in the 1930s were considered a fifth column because the Zionists had already betrayed Germany in 1916. And so the Germans had good reason to perceive at least Zionists as politically dangerous. Some of the people who are commenting, some of the diplomats who are commenting on the situation of Jews in Germany in the 1930s say, you know, when I look at the percentage of Jews in high places and what they're doing, at least some of them said, I can understand it happening. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here, with the last portion of this slide, there were two phenomena operative. The phenomena of pre-traumatic stress disorder had Western Jews being anxious about and exaggerating any threat to the Jewish community in Germany or in Germany-controlled territories. That's on the level of the individual Jewish community. The Jewish leadership was doing something else. You'll remember that in 1933, the Jewish leadership declared war on Germany. Samuel Untermyer went on nationwide radio in 1933 and said, because Germany will not rehire the many Jews that were dismissed from their academic and political positions, Judea is declaring war on Germany. And they instituted a boycott that was really economically devastating. This was the beginning of the Zionist war on Germany. And in addition to the pre-traumatic stress disorder, what I see in the treatment of Howard Harold Wilton and Doug Reed. The Zionist leadership declared war in 1933, and that war is ongoing as we speak. The reason I say it's ongoing as we speak is that during World War II, there were at least two factions in the American government that were involved with and making known what was actually happening in Europe. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Josiah Dubois, and a third party were basically, I will say that they're victims of pre-traumatic stress disorder. That they were exaggerating, they were pestering the government to do something about the persecution of Jews in Europe. And they were continually doing that to the point that Franklin Roosevelt got disgusted and said, "You want to do something about it? I just made you a member of the War Refugee Board." Henry Morgenthau Jr. became one of 3 members of the War Refugee Board who were assigned to cooperate with agencies in Europe in order to get as many Jews as they possibly could out of Europe. And Henry Morgenthau Jr. and Josiah Dubois worked at that. In the process of working at that, they came in contact with a variety of sources from Europe. And up until they got a hold of what is called the Verba-Wetzler report, they were in a tug of war. I said there were 2 factions, didn't I? The one faction was stressing the necessity to do something about German persecution of Jews. The other faction was in the State Department, who basically were saying, "Now calm your jets, we know what's going on and we'll take care of it." Now, if the Morgenthau faction was claiming that there's a great deal of persecution going on with Jews, what was the point of view of the people in the State Department? Were they anti-Semites? Or did they know that most of the information that Morgenthau and company were getting was propaganda? The flights that were taken, that were made, the recon flights that were taken over a variety of places where disasters were supposed to have taken place, showed no evidence of that. Indeed, the recon photos of Auschwitz and some other camps are embarrassing because the things that are supposed to be there simply aren't there. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point that I am making is that the State Department was telling them to be careful with the information that they were releasing to the public. The Verba-Wetzler report came from 2 Slovakian Jews who escaped from Auschwitz, escaped to, I don't recall the name of the city, but they made a report to the Slovak Jewish Council. And between what they said and what the Slovak Jewish Council wrote down, they wrote something like an 18-page letter about what was happening to Jews in Auschwitz. This got into the hands of Henry Morgenthau Jr., and when his other 2 members of the War Refugee Board were not available to vote on it, Henry Morgenthau Jr. took it upon himself to release this report to the public. The newspapers had it beforehand, by the way. The newspapers of the United States had looked at it. They said, "You know what? This has the smell of old herring to it." When Morgenthau, as an officer of the U.S. government, released it as if it were authoritative, it suddenly became information rather than propaganda. And ever since it was released, the story has become more and more solidified as fact that Jews were being destroyed en masse by the German government. That story became solidified in the terms of the 6 million, became solidified in terms of the stories about gas chambers, became solidified in the form of an official decree to destroy European Jewry. That's the essence of the official Holocaust. It was fear and rumor and imagination until the Verba report was released. Then it acquired the status of fact. It has now acquired the status of dogma, but that's another matter. The first mention of gassing of Jews appears in Anne Frank's diary. And Anne Frank learned about it from British radio. The British and the Soviets were engaged in black propaganda against Germany, and they were publishing false stories about Germans to Germans, just as the American public had been subjected to false stories about Germans in World War I. There was all kinds of black propaganda issued in World War I in order to get Americans to back the war. There was all kinds of black propaganda being piped into Germany by the Soviet Union and by the British. I don't know if by the Americans per se. But in any case, there were lies being published to the Germans about the Germans in order to destroy German morale. It's absolutely crucial to recognize that when the German leadership was put on trial at Nuremberg, the account that they were attempting to exterminate Jews came as news to them. Now, of course, everyone who is defending the Holocaust will say that they were lying. Well, the more I look at the data, the more I think they were amazed to be told that they were trying to exterminate the Jews.
What about the pictures, all the people who died?
Now, you're getting a little bit ahead of me, but there were a lot of people who died, especially in the last 2 months of the war. There were enormously painful and terrible scenes of emaciated people in the liberated camps. We never saw the extent to which the civilians in Germany were also suffering, because with the saturation bombing of Germany in the latter several months of the war, everyone was suffering, and suffering severely. Am I saying that the inmates did not suffer? Absolutely not. They suffered terribly. They suffered as victims of prisoners of a losing regime that had barely enough to feed their own soldiers, much less their own civilians, much less their own prisoners. So yes, they died of starvation, they died of typhus, and some of them probably died of gunshot wounds, okay? But there were no 6 million. In fact, out of curiosity, the official death toll for the Holocaust now has been graciously reduced to 4.5 million. But the mythic 6 million is going to be emblazoned on people's minds for the next several centuries. But yes, did people, if you want to see whether war crimes were committed in World War II, I would submit that you need to look at Hamburg, Dresden, and Hiroshima, as well as Auschwitz. As soon as Morgenthau released this Verba report, it became official history. In the 17th century, everyone knew that witches were real, and after the release of the Verba report, everyone in the United States knew that Nazis were trying to exterminate the Jews. And pointing out what Catherine has already mentioned, the liberation of the concentration camps by the Allies presented a very confirming picture. A debate developed, I want to mention, in addition to that, the Germans who had Allied prisoners of war returned 93% of their prisoners of war back to the Allies at the end of the war. The Allies who had German prisoners of war returned about 70% to Germany. The remainder either died in our own concentration camps. I refer you to a book called Other Losses by James Bonnke. James Bonnke is one of those interesting characters who did great research and destroyed his career by telling the truth. He wrote Other Losses and Crimes and Mercies. I commend them to you. You'll need a strong stomach, but James does an excellent job of research. Joan, you wanted to say something? Or?
No, I was just.
Okay. A debate developed as to how to deal with the Nazi leadership. The American Jewish Council wanted at least the appearance of a trial. The Russians were voting for serial executions of the highest leadership, and the Americans were ambivalent, but both Jews and the American public were seeking vengeance. I don't know to what extent the American press, the same American press that had made the Verber report into history, whether they were seeking vengeance. What I do know is that the American public wanted somebody to pay for World War II, and pay not just financially, but pay in a moral sense. That's the first time, by the way, in no earlier war was there a national press for vengeance. All wars up to that time were considered legal. It was, you'll remember, the Nuremberg trials that made a war of aggression the quintessential war crime. Interestingly enough, the world's population thought that because the Allies had declared that aggressive war was the quintessential war crime, that they were going to abide by the restrictions. That is, aggressive war was going to be forbidden. France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States have never restrained their actions because their actions were aggressive war. The war against Iraq, the war against Vietnam, these were wars of aggression. So within 20 years of Nuremberg, we were already violating what was the quintessential, we were already violating the dictates of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Among the charges that were going to be placed against German accused, I will call them accused because that's the most accurate term. They were going to be charged with war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity, one of which being the specific charge of the attempted extermination of European Jews. What is very interesting about it is that Robert Jackson and the principal prosecutor for the Brits made the charge of attempted extermination key to their prosecution. But in private conversations, everyone around Jackson in private conversation said, there's masses of evidence that the Jews were being exterminated and destroyed by the Germans. Robert Jackson's response was, show it to me. It isn't here. In fact, when I started studying this, I was reminded of that little clip from the Ken Burns episode on the Civil War where Abraham Lincoln is commenting on the railroad bridge that was built over the Potomac Creek. He says, it was put up in 3 weeks, and there's nothing there. It was really a rickety bridge. They had to rebuild it about 3 times. But Lincoln is astonished that this bridge is being used to hold trains, and there's nothing in it. Well, the same is unfortunately true of the evidence that was presented at Nuremberg. Interestingly enough, judicial critics now recognize how flawed the Nuremberg tribunals were as instruments of legal justice. Even Robert Jackson, when he was when he was acting as chief prosecutor, he did not say that this was a judicial proceeding. He said this was the last battle in the war in World War II. It was a battle to demonstrate the immorality and the illegality of the German behavior. As you may have read, I frankly think that the American government's reluctance to let us know what is happening in Guantanamo Bay is because there are substantial parallels between the behavior of the prosecutors at Nuremberg, and not so much the prosecutors, but the behavior of the interrogators at Nuremberg and the behavior of the interrogators at Guantanamo Bay. Nuremberg created crimes retroactively and considered the reality of the accused criminality, considered their criminality to be self-evident. They did not have to prove the existence of the crime. They felt it necessary to identify who the criminals were, but they did not feel it necessary to identify, to determine the actuality, the factuality of a crime. You know, to prove a murder, you not only need a body, you need the forensic evidence that the body was killed, that the body died in a fashion that was not normal. By this vengeance approach, the Holocaust, which was a rumor in 1943 and a fact once the Verbo report, was established without forensic examination, but with a lot of eyewitness evidence and extracted confessions. Now the eyewitnesses, there are a host of witnesses, none of whom were effectively cross-examined. It's absolutely astonishing the extent to which witnesses who present a host of theoretically useful information that is very damaging to the defense, these witnesses are not cross-examined by the defense. Which, by the way, gives me a cause to comment. The lawyers who were defending the accused were not American or French or Soviet lawyers. They were German lawyers. Now, at one level, that may seem to you to be very fair. But remember, Germany was already both conquered and starving. From a professional perspective, as well as from a social perspective, they were the weakest people in the room. They did not have the same kind of standing that the American, French, and Soviet lawyers had, because they were on the defeated side. They had no chance of winning their case. The best they could do was present the best exoneration that they could. They declined to cross-examine a host of witnesses that said some of the most remarkable things. I'll give you just a couple of examples. At Yad Vashem, I know this because a young lady I know visited there recently. At Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, they are still exhibiting the lampshades that were made out of human skin. But they weren't. When those lampshades were finally examined, they were goat skin. There were shrunken heads exhibited at Nuremberg. But unfortunately, before those shrunken heads could be examined, they disappeared out of the security lockers. There's virtually zero forensic evidence of extermination. I'm not talking about people who died because of sadistic guards. There almost certainly were. I'm not talking about people who died of typhus. I'm not talking about people who died of hunger. I'm talking about people who didn't die because of cyanide gas, who didn't die because of carbon monoxide, who didn't die because of electrocution. We have no forensic evidence of that. As another piece of evidence for the lack of validity of the Nuremberg trials, the confession of Rudolf Huss. Huss is the first and longest serving officer as commandant of Auschwitz. He was caught shortly before the Nuremberg tribunals and acted as a witness at the Nuremberg tribunals. His so-called confession, which was long, but I cannot recall exactly how long, was a confession that he signed. It was not in, it was purported to be in his words, but it was typed up and he signed it. After he was interrogated for 48 hours, and during that interrogation, a medic who was supervising the interrogation told the interrogators that they better stop unless they wanted to take a corpse back to the courtroom. I will point out, by the way, and the military knows this. The military knew this in Guantanamo Bay, the military knew this in Abu Ghraib. Torture is very good if you want a confession. Torture is totally useless if you want information. I tell the story of a female Israeli soldier who witnessed something, and a little while later, a male Israeli soldier brought a person whom they said, "We think this is the guy who did it." And the female soldier, "I don't know, did he confess?" The male soldier said, "He will." But what if he doesn't confess? He will. Torture is very good at extracting confessions. They have no validity whatsoever in terms of the factuality of the confession. But in order to stop the pain, the confession will be given. No doubt about it.
So you can never use those truth serums, the serums, they never were real, right? I mean, you just inject and they tell the truth. Or hypnosis, where it doesn't hurt somebody, they never extract.
A very good question. The so-called truth serums will be good at lowering a person's inhibition. They will be good at decreasing the effectiveness of a person's internal watchdog. But they'll also be very good at increasing a person's ability to fantasize. So when I was teaching anesthesia, I told all the student anesthesiologists, be very careful what you say and what you do when the person is emerging from anesthesia, because they will have no context in which to interpret what they hear or see, and therefore they will create a context for it. I am confident that at least a certain percentage of sexual assaults that take place under anesthesia never took place. But a very suggestible person experienced something that they interpreted as sexual assault. Now, I'm not saying that about all. I'm just saying that a person who is suggestible will create their context if a context isn't there for them. Your other question, however,
What's
was...
hypnosis?
Hypnosis is very complex in and of itself, and I don't know if it has ever been... A person who is determined not to be hypnotized will be very, very difficult to hypnotize.
So you're saying that after the war, There was no evidence found by the Allied troops of gas chambers.
That's correct. 0. Now, we do have evidence of people trying to simulate gas chambers. In fact, I call you,
Oh, simulate.
yeah. David Cole, if you have the time, you can download it. David Cole has a video on YouTube called something like The Real Truth About Auschwitz, where he spends a substantial amount of time interrogating the person who's in charge of Auschwitz Memorial Camp now about what is seen. Now, what is told to the visitors is that here's the gas chamber where people die. But when David Cole asks specific questions, something very interesting comes out. There is no evidence of cyanide gas having been used in those areas. There is evidence of shower drains having been in the floor and removed. There's evidence of post-World War II holes having been made in the ceiling, so it would look like this is where Cyclone B chips were dropped through the hole, dropped to the floor. But those weren't there during World War II. So there is a substantial effort to make it look as if it's a gas chamber. But there's no forensic evidence to suggest that it ever was a gas chamber. Oh, in terms of torture, was mentioning physical torture being one of those used that was definitely used against Rudolf Huss. But a lot of people were induced to give false testimony by saying, if you don't tell us this is what we want to hear, your family will be given over to the Soviets. Now, the people who were feared more than the Nazis on the Eastern Front were the Soviets. And if you listen to what Ilya Ehrenberg has to say about, Ilya Ehrenberg was a propagandist and in charge of certain military maneuvers on the Eastern Front. He dedicated his papers to the museum in Israel rather than to Russia. And what he says to the Soviet troops about German women and about fighting the Germans is literally inhuman. It sounds like something out of the 8th or 9th century. So I won't abuse you with it, but he says a day when you haven't killed a German is not a day worth living. So not all torture is physical torture. In fact, a substantial number of people were induced to give the kind of testimony that they wanted to have given by threats, either of sending the family to the Soviet Union, which happened with some of the partisans in Greece, unfortunately, or having a longer sentence. In fact, some of the witnesses were also accused. So if you gave the correct testimony, your own sentence would be shorter. In addition to the elements of injustice in the Nuremberg tribunals, a substantial percentage of the American delegation were American Jews, including two very prominent Jews who, one whom was the guiding spirit leading the way to Nuremberg. Remember I said they had vengeance rather than justice on their mind? And Bernays said, not the Bernays who was famous for propaganda. This Bernays persuaded the War Secretary Stimson to accept the idea of putting the German leaders on trial. Mickey Marcus selected most of the judges, and he later volunteered as a commander for the Zionist Haganah. Josiah Dubois was a member of the delegation for the IMT trials, and he was one of the 3 in the Treasury Department who were pleading that the government do something because of German persecution of Jews. The military tribunals had a number of faults, and I pointed out to a number of them. One that I haven't mentioned is that they were only trying the defeated. And some charges even had to be dropped when it could be easily proven that the Allies had done exactly the same thing. In fact, if it had been a military tribunal about the war crimes of World War II, everyone in the higher commands would have been on trial. And I don't only have to point to Auschwitz or Treblinka, but to Hamburg and Dresden and Hiroshima. There were no good guys. The aspect of the Nuremberg tribunals that I want to consider seriously, however, was that on the special interpretation of German persecution of Jews. Because Germans came to hate not only Zionists, but in a non-discriminatory way, or an indiscriminate way, they came to see all Jews as untrustworthy. Now, German propaganda lent itself to misinterpretation. I'll be the first to admit that. Vernichtung can mean destruction, can mean annihilation. In other contexts, however, it can mean destruction of political or economic power. In other words, it means destruction, but destruction is physical, economic, emotional. I can destroy a person emotionally, and they'll be perfectly fine physically, but their minds will be ruined. So Vernichtung does not necessarily mean physical destruction, and that's the word that was very commonly used in German oratory about what they wanted to see done with the Jewish community. I mentioned that the forensic evidence has long since been debunked or has disappeared. Eyewitness testimony, the only 2 witnesses that have been cross-examined, and this did not take place at Nuremberg, it took place at the trial of Ernst Zundel in Canada in the 1980s. But Rudolf Verba, one of the 2 authors of the Verba report, was called as an expert witness for the prosecution because they wanted to convict Ernst Zundel of spreading false information. And Rudolf Verba, by the correct questions being asked of Mr. Verba, Rudolf Verba kept having to retract and retract until he came to the point of saying, well, in this book or with this statement, he couldn't even use the English. I used licentia poetica, which is a Latin phrase, Joan already knows. It's the Latin phrase for poetic license. The prosecuting attorney who had called Verba as a professional, as an expert witness, was so disgusted with Verba's testimony that he dismissed him as a witness. So at least one, I don't recall what happened with the other witness. I apologize for that. But this is the evidence on which the Holocaust legend hangs. And it, well, in my opinion, it doesn't hang. I mentioned cyanide gas, asphyxiation by diesel fumes, gasoline engine exhaust, electrocution and drowning. As I pointed out to Catherine, no gas chambers remain. I want to point out, the Soviets were every bit as interested as the Americans, the French, and the British, and the Jews. They were every bit as interested in accumulating all of the damning evidence against the Germans. If any people, apart from the Jews, had reason to hate the Nazis, it was the Russians, the Soviets. after signing a non-aggression pact, Hitler invades Stalin's Soviet Union without warning. The Soviet Union was really, if not totally, largely unprepared. They lost somewhere between 25 and 35 million people in the Soviet Union. If anyone had a reason to despise Nazi Germany, it was the Soviets. So everyone wanted evidence against Germany. They couldn't find it. They even went so far as to synthesize a very badly synthesized. They went about changing what almost certainly was a shower stall at Auschwitz into what looked like a gas chamber. But anyone carefully examining it knows it wasn't a gas chamber. In fact, so eager were the Allies to create evidence that at Dresden, 99% sure it was at Dresden, the Americans attempted to mimic what the Russians had done at Auschwitz. But when it became clear from historical records that there were no gas chambers at Dresden, they disassembled it. So the Americans were no better than the Russians in their effort to synthesize evidence. They simply picked the wrong place to try to do it. There are a host of technical reasons as to why the Auschwitz part of the story could not be true. And the Auschwitz authorities, well, this is incidental. They've reduced, at one point in time, it was claimed that Auschwitz was responsible for the deaths of 4 million people. That has now been officially reduced to 1.1 million. And the only reason I point this out is that the factuality is second to the myth. The fact that the official Holocaust is down to 4.5 million rather than 6 million is almost irrelevant, because it is the myth that people remember. I will point out that the lobby defending the official account is very powerful. And for that very reason, revisionist historians, those who are described as Holocaust deniers, and I don't think anyone, well, there might be 2 or 3 nuts in some corner, but no responsible historian denies that people were singled out, and the Jewish people in particular, especially toward the end of the 1930s, were singled out as enemies of the state. No one denies that. What they do choose to examine is the excrement of that dinosaur. And when they look through the excrement of that dinosaur, they do not find the forensic evidence that justifies the accusation. Germar Rudolph has done a number of pieces, some of which are downloadable from the internet, and Carlo Montano is an Italian researcher who has also done some very good work. I will confess to you that as a young chemist, long before I got involved in Holocaust studies, I thought to myself when I first heard the story about mass executions by cyanide, I asked myself, could the Germans really have been that stupid? I won't bother you with the details of what is involved, but I will point out that in professionally designed gas chambers in the United States, when cyanide was once used as an execution technique, it took 15 minutes for the victim to reliably die in a hermetically sealed, negative pressure gas chamber. And at Auschwitz, we're told that hundreds of people died in 30 minutes, and that the room was ready for reoccupation in 30 minutes. Let me describe just a little bit, not to be too morbid. When a person dies of hydrogen cyanide, especially in that kind of context, if they have anything in their bowels, it's going to be evacuated. If they have anything in their bladders, it's going to be evacuated. When they are lying as corpses on the ground, their skin is going to be absorbing hydrogen cyanide. So that anyone cleaning up after that individual is going to be exposed to hydrogen. The people cleaning up that gas chamber would be highly likely to die of cyanide poisoning. It just ain't possible. You know, I said we were looking through the excrement of the dinosaur. When you look at the details, it doesn't work. If you look at the Verba report, one of the things that the Verba report includes is that Auschwitz conducted 6,000 when you burn a body. Cremation. 6,000 cremations per day. Now, the people writing that report clearly knew absolutely nothing about cremation. Cremation takes, under the technology that was available in the 1940s, cremation takes 3 hours. And Auschwitz had, if I recall correctly, 8 crematory ovens. 8 times 3, or rather, 3 hours goes into 24 hours, 8. 8 times. So in a span of 24 hours, you can get 8 bodies times 8. 3 times 8 is 24. I had this worked out, now I don't. Okay, 3 hours. From 8 ovens, in 3 you get 8 per oven. 8 per oven and 8 ovens, 64. Okay, sorry it took me so long in the math. Let's suppose, which is claimed, that they put 2 bodies in each oven. That brings the total number up to what?
128.
That's the maximum you can do. That's just one of the many inconsistencies of the Verba report, which tells you why the American newspapers were reluctant to publish it as information. The American newspapers recognized it as propaganda, but when you want to believe something, the unbelievable becomes possible. The Queen of Hearts made it a policy to believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Morgenthau Jr., Josiah Dubois, Alan Dershowitz. If you want to believe it, you can. I go back. Germany's great misfortune, and this is why I think the Holocaust is the last episode of Zionists' war on Germany, because they had the great misfortune of having both the Soviets, the Americans, the English, and the Zionists as their enemies. And fidelity of evidence didn't exist. The 6 million factor is a recurrent piece of data, usually loosely connected to the Jews of Galicia, the area of Romania, Poland, and Russia, and Ukraine. It basically is a figment of Jewish imagination, but it's easily construed, the plan is construed from German oratory. Remember, words like Vernechtung and Sonderbehandlung, special treatment. If you've got a preset idea as to what these mean, you can imagine a great host of things. If you don't know what they mean, you ask, what does the context say they mean? Gas chambers are a fiction created by the British propagandist, as first mentioned by Anne Frank, probably invented by Zyklon Lee. And by the way, it's worth pointing out that there are a number of pieces of data, you know, the excrement of the dinosaur, that are grossly inconsistent. Let me give you an example. Even people who believe the Holocaust official story. Those who have examined the official story say 95% of the Zyklon B was used for delousing clothing. And 5% of it was used as a murder weapon. Now, the reputed gas chambers at Auschwitz were running day and night, with Zyklon B theoretically being used up every 30 minutes. A delousing chamber is exposed to Zyklon B gas for about 4 days minimum, sometimes up to a week. So you got one canister being used for 4 days, and 24 times 7, over 100 canisters being used, if it's being used regularly, in the extermination chambers. So how can only 5% of the Zyklon B gas that was bought by the German military, how can only 95% of it have been used in extermination? It doesn't compute. And probably as a last comment, Raoul Hilberg, who is really known as the Dean of Holocaust Studies, in his master book on the destruction of European Jewry, if you go through his list of sources, you find him using sources that have been discredited. And I don't mean discredited mildly. I mean people who are basically writing fiction. And Raoul Hilberg cites that individual or that book as if it is accurate. I mean, if a 5th grade student handed me that kind of paper, I'd give him a C. No, I'd give him a D. But Hilberg, because of his reputation, gets away with saying that he is a master of studies. My last point is those who will want to believe, whether they are Dershowitz or Verba, they will believe in the myth, in the legend. Were Germans really that stupid? One additional piece of information that demonstrates how stupid the Germans would have been to use the methods described. Throughout World War II, in fact, beginning with about the 1920s, wood gas generators were commonly used. A wood gas generator incompletely burns wood. It passes air over the hot coals of the wood, creating vast amounts of carbon monoxide, which is why when you are using your charcoal broiler and you're actually burning charcoal, you must never put that inside your house, not even inside your porch, because vast amounts of carbon monoxide are created by the air moving over the red hot coals. Now, you can capture that carbon monoxide gas and burn it. Vehicles were used throughout Europe from about 1920, and especially during the 1930s and during the war. Vehicles throughout Germany were using wood gas generators. They would burn wood on the back with incomplete combustion, take the exhaust gases from the wood gas generator and deliver those gases to their vehicle. And those gases would draw, because it was combustible carbon monoxide, those gases were used to operate the machinery, just as you would gasoline. Instead of putting liquid gasoline in, you put gaseous carbon monoxide. Works fine. You can eat vast quantities of carbon monoxide. And if the Germans had really wanted to exterminate the Jews, all they would have had to do is put one of those wood gas generators in a hut with the Jews sleeping after their long trip. And they would be dead the next morning. If a person is able to ask the question free of the propaganda, free of the legend, then frankly, Scientifically, the issue is really easy to solve. But getting people to look at the question of extermination from a scientific and historical perspective is very, very difficult. And the official story is vigorously contested, or no. How shall I put this? My answer, and the answer of people who look at the question scientifically, is vigorously disputed by people with an emotional. The vast majority of Jews have been victimized themselves from an emotional or financial or political point of view. They have a great reason to oppose it. If you think the state of Germany, along with the state of the United States, have been largely responsible for the economic success of the state of Israel. Without the largesse that the United States government gives, and without the military equipment and the financial support that the modern state of Germany provides Israel, it would be a basket case. It also, there's little doubt in most people's minds that the vote at the UN in 1948, or 1947, would have been, the probability of it being quite different is much higher if the Holocaust myth had not already been well publicized. So I would submit that the Zionists have very successfully turned a rumor into a fact, into a legend. They've been exploiting the German people and the American people ever since. And I'll point out that the people who have been presenting the truth, as I think I have this afternoon, we've not been proven wrong. But Germar Rudolph lost a career. Fred Leuchter, who was the initial person examining the Auschwitz facility, lost his career. Germar Rudolph, his first wife, left him with his children. She could not take the strain of his public disapprobation. And sometimes they've had the hell beaten out of them, like Robert Feuerson. So, speaking the truth is kind of fun, but it's rarely very profitable. Even very attentive. Questions? Dawn?
Did they, was the point of the delousing chambers so that the Germans could reuse the clothes on the people that they brought to the...
Yeah. In fact, you point something out. The clothes and the shoes that you often seen as evidence of the extermination. One of the camps had a facility for repairing shoes and for repairing clothing so that they could be redistributed either to people in the camp or to the local villagers. And in other places, shoes and clothing were donated by the villagers around the camp in order to provide some kind of clothing and shoes for the people who came without such supplies. So the villagers were supportive of the people, of the inmates, to the extent that they wanted to keep them, they wanted to provide some kind of livable provisions for them. I'll point out that Elie Wiesel, who made quite a career of the Holocaust industry, when he and his father were in a position of either waiting at the camp that he was currently incarcerated at and being liberated by the Soviets, or going back to Germany with his German captors, even though, quote, they faced extermination, unquote. They chose to go back to Germany with their German captors, suggesting strongly that they didn't believe that they were walking into extermination camps. But you have to look at that dinosaur's excrement. If you just listen to what people tell you to believe, you're going to be led down the garden path. And who was it who said, a nation of sheep begets a government of wolves? Now, there's one other point that I'd like to make, because if anyone winds up watching this videotape, I want to point out that of all of the people who have been exploited by the Holocaust myth, a lot of them are Jewish. The Jews have been saddled with a myth of persecution. They have been saddled with a myth that the whole world is against them. And it's a very small percentage of that Jewish population that benefits from that myth. The people who benefit from that myth are the people who benefit from the financial support of Israel. The people who benefit from that myth are the people who can gather the Jewish people together as one emotional political force and say, let's go there. And like groups of people anywhere, they will tend to follow the people who's leading them. I think it's a very small percentage of the Jewish leadership that is responsible for this travesty of justice. And the Jews in particular have suffered from the myth. So I don't want anyone to think that the Jews as a collective body have been responsible for it. They're every bit as much victims as the Goyim who have supported Israel. That's my last word on it, I think.
You mentioned an author, one of his works was Other Losses. I didn't get that.
James Bakke, B-A-C-Q-U-E.
B-A...
B-A-C-Q-U-E.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Did you ask something, Tom?
No, I was going to say, that was great. That was your best presentation so far. Thank you.
Next week, we're going to talk about finances and the Fed. And then I really need people to, I'm going to do one of two things, my friends. I'm going to start showing more documentaries, which may be frustrating for Dawn, and using them for commentary, because I literally spent this is not looking for sympathy, it's just sharing information, okay? Because I wanted to understand the subject before presenting it to you, I spent 3 weeks, and that was only in this last week that I learned of that second dimension. I knew the facts and figures. I had the dots connected with respect to the mass hysteria that was transmitted from some people to the Jewish people, to the American Jewish people, to the American people, and subsequently to the rest of the Western world. I could see those dots being connected. It wasn't until I heard about Robert Wilton and Doug Greed that I understood that there was an overarching plan to it. Because the Jewish leadership declared war on Germany in 1933, and with every delivery of a German submarine to the state of Israel, that war is still going on. And if the German people ever liberate themselves from the guilt complex that has been imposed on them, it's going to be a major job helping them, A, to liberate themselves, and B, not to demand vengeance. Because what has been done to the German people is just unspeakable.
Well, the question has been posed before, why do we have a Holocaust museum? And what would we think if Germany had an American slavery museum?
Or if Japan had a Holocaust museum commemorating Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know that the very fact that you ask the question, Joan, reveals that you know the answer. Americans are in love with the idea that they are exceptional.
Oh,
No. Now, we are the moral leaders of the world. Didn't you know that? And as the moral leaders of the world, we have to commemorate enormous suffering of the Jewish people under these horrendous, they've accomplished a number of things. We have the quintessential demon in Adolf Hitler. We have the quintessential victims in the Jewish people. We don't need to look at the history. We have the myth to follow. We don't have to look at the way terrorists were involved in the Civil War, because we know what really took place, don't we? We don't have to look at the fact that land merchants in the Revolutionary War wanted to break the British treaty with the American Indians and move westward. It was because of the tea tax, wasn't it? When it was really emerging American imperialism. Most, not all, but most of the leaders of the revolution were large landholders, and a substantial percentage of them were slaveholders. We've been imperialists for a long time.
Yes.